Oh, I have some cell phone battery life left. Yes, I've been listening to Germaine Greer, who I think she probably is the proto-identity politics person, although she is quite aghast with the general program, I think, of identity politics. But I think it's actually worthwhile to notice that her ideological implements are pretty much exactly the same. She doesn't really make arguments so much as she makes assertions and complaints that basically produce a narrative of oppression that needs to be systematically dismantled and deconstructed. She doesn't provide alternatives, and she's not really that interested in looking at the other side to actually forge an alternative. You know, she's only interested in one side of the equation, basically. Women's liberation, you know, and when you're interested in such a thing as that, you're not interested in liberation culture, as it were. You're not interested in actually working out towards the general platform of the synthesized, you know, sort of it's not focusing on any kind of process. It's just focusing on, I don't like this, fix it for me. Which is ironic, because her major complaint that actually sort of gives her narrative its assertive bite is that, you know, she says, you know, it's interesting for someone, you know, women have these unique and particular expressions of femininity, and they don't all have to subscribe to it, but she stereotypes men profoundly, and she just says men are always saying, what about me? And so any complaint against her is just, you know, well, you're just a man saying, what about me? You know, it's actually embarrassing, the sort of the double standard here. And then she gets away with it because, well, I'm just focusing on my issue. It's at least the identity politics people, hypothetically, although I mean this is where they claim their moral supremacy, is that well, actually, I guess you can't even say that anymore, because it's sort of, you know, it's interesting, because identity politics is one step more disorientating and deranging from Germaine Greer. It's like Germaine Greer swallowed within a sort of, you know, like, well, everyone could be free if we just dismantled the whiteness, patriarchy. You know, it's all welded to what can only be described as a boogeyman. But yeah, you can see the elements in it, in Germaine. And I mean, I wish I was that better at typing people. I wonder what she is. She's a kind of ESTP perhaps, or a... I wonder if she could be an ENTP. it's this weird sort of individuality for me and not for thee. The group that I want liberation for are all passive individuals that have been corrupted and oppressed, and everyone else is a kind of generic entity of systematic force and pressure. And then this kind of this abject complaining that, well, we can only have self-esteem if we're allowed to sort of disobey the conventions, because the conventions were set up by people that don't share the same sympathy with our identity. And this projection that, there's this kind of intellectual sympathy that is much more wise. And I mean, Germaine Greer is inconsistent on this point, as they all have to be inconsistent on this point, because it's impossible to have a workable ideology that also seems reasonable if you don't sort of fudge the treatment of this issue. And so, they're sort of highly erratic and ad hoc in how they apply their mind to what gets sympathy and what is actually the veiled oppression of the system that is controlling people like a zombie. And the amount of diversion and political corruption that's facilitated by having this kind of this market for identity, for delivering the people their identity and the self-esteem to their identity, that crowds out all other what would otherwise be, a kind of secular politics. Now you've got this sort of identitarian cult sort of zero sum, whose identity is doing better. And they're very interested in invoking that narrative and reducing everything into those terms and only those terms. And if you try to break that formulation, if you break that analysis, then you are an agent of the appropriate devil. The bottom line is that you're not. But it's interesting how the weaponizing of vulnerability, so that people don't and even are proud to not being able to engage in reasoned discussion. Because they need a safe space and room to be able to just sort of launch their puerile assertions. Germaine Greer notices that people are rejecting Western values in the Islamic world, for instance, because of the nihilism. but she fails to properly diagnose the level of nihilistic and narcissistic corruption which she is a bit responsible in facilitating and pandering to. Now it's interesting because I would say that there are elements in what Germaine Greer says that are very reasonable, and they're the kernel of perhaps even a proactive analysis or diagnosis. Oh yeah, that's finally I remember my other point. My point is that on the level of diagnosis. The biggest problem with identity politics is that it's fundamentally the wrong diagnosis. And it has no capability to make itself intellectually vulnerable to revising that diagnosis. It's not capable of doing so. I guess the biggest problem is they are doing all these things. There's something to be said about hostages. There's no form of navigation that sort of